de la Chambre des communes qui a débuté le vendredi 21 mai 2021. Oh,
Hearing French.
I'm sorry, I was on the wrong channel.
All right, we can start that again. Are we set? Okay. I call this meeting back to order. This is a resumption of meeting number 32 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence, which started on Friday, May the 21st, 2021. Please, and thank you, Madame Gallant, for bringing that to our attention right away. If at any time we lose interpretation, please let us know as soon as possible, because it's important that everyone have the opportunity to fully participate in these proceedings. Again, much to my own reminder as anyone else's, when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. If you have very technical information to share, please provide it in advance for the interpreters to use. So, and when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. Resuming debate on Mr. Bazan's motion, Mr. Spengeman, you had the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome, colleagues. And I hope everybody had a good weekend, had a chance to reflect on the work that's ahead of us. I think we are slowly, perhaps, but I think we are making some progress in terms of this particular issue that's been in front of us for some time now. I think members of the committee have characterized it as potentially the most important issue that this committee has faced in its recent history. I think it is extremely important that we come up with our vision of a way forward of recommendations that will solve this issue, both with respect to the accountability that's attached to the cases that have come before the committee, including the former chiefs of defense staffs, but also the systematicity of this issue and the question of culture change within the Canadian Armed Forces that's so urgently required and that many witnesses, including the minister himself, have spoken to us about. Madam Chair, when I had the floor at our last session, I had taken the committee through a good portion of a report entitled Report on Inappropriate Behaviours of the United Kingdom of July 2019. The most recent section I addressed dealt with the preemption of inappropriate behaviours in the British Armed Forces. And I will have more to add on that further on in the discussion, but I thought I would just take a moment to take a step back and reflect on where we are as a committee. I realize that we are close to the summer recess. There are partisan winds blowing in various parts of the House and committees, and that's understandable as a function of where we are in the process and the issues that are in front of us, which have partisan dimensions. I believe that this issue, Madam Chair, really is one in which we need to work expeditiously now, and in terms of the number of sessions that we still have available to us to overcome partisanship. And I had made reference in previous interventions to work that I was part of in the 42nd Parliament and a number of colleagues on this committee as well, including Mr. Bazan, Ms. Gallant, Monsieur Robillard, and Mr. Garrison on the work that we did on diversity and inclusion. Different circumstances, different time in political history, was a majority government, but I think a very strong view by this committee that we had to move to the same side of the table on DNI, as it's called. There were questions relating to sexual misconduct in front of the committee, not as sharply pointed because we didn't have the evidence in front of us relating to the former chiefs of defense staff. But it was just an experience that really shows Canadians and showed us as members of this committee what we can do if we are united and if we're able to overcome partisan reflexes. And in this particular instance, in the last Parliament on this report, there was no dissent. I think we were all on the same page. We may have had disagreement and discussion with respect to some of the minutiae of the report, but the issue and its importance was very much alive and in front of us, and we were able to come up with some very good recommendations that are impactful and that are some of which are in the course of being implemented. I think we need to find a way, and maybe this afternoon's discussion can be a pathway to that, to overcome to the greatest extent possible. We may not be able to fully, but to overcome the partisan obstacles to this particular report. Because the stakes have gone up, the urgency is greater, the expectations are higher. And Madam Chair, the reason, again, that I raised some of the comparative experience from other countries is to show not only that this shouldn't be a partisan issue inside our borders, but this is an issue with with which many other militaries are grappling for the same reasons of chain of command, of generations of military culture that is not conducive to inclusion, the role of women through other work that we've done as the Canadian Forces in women, peace and security has been at the forefront of our work in many ways. But these other militaries are also facing the very same questions, and in some cases have gone out front with respect to not only reports, as the United Kingdom have done, but also follow-ups, very expeditious follow-ups within a year in the British case that might be illuminating to us as well. I think this issue can be resolved efficiently and expeditiously if we overcome those partisan hurdles. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to do that. With respect to Mr. Bazan's motion, I think one of the obstacles was the structuring of discussion time, Madam Chair. I mean, procedurally, it does limit your own discretion to sort of guide the discussion as chair of the committee when we're in camera and dealing with the reports, and making sure that members have not only equitable time to intervene, but also constructive time to comment on each other's thoughts. And if we're only letting each member of the committee speak once for 2 minutes, yes, we can get our voice in, but we can't really build on each other's thoughts and priorities and reflections. I think what's most important for us is that we find among the now relatively lengthy list of important recommendations that's in front of us, in part those that are most impactful and those that are most implementable in the short term. And if we agree on those across party lines, then we should flag them, we should identify them, approve them, move forward on them in whichever way we choose. There may be others where discussions are going to be more tracted. Hopefully there won't be any that are strictly partisan in nature. I think those discussions had to happen. They did happen in this committee. And again, it's very natural to have partisan disagreement. But I just want to go back to the what I've described as the tip of the iceberg, the case of the former Chief of Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance, who was appointed by the former government in the face of an ongoing investigation, whose tenure then succeeded or continued into this government with extremely troublesome allegations and evidence, and ultimately a report that the former Chief of Defence Staff himself felt himself to be so empowered that he owns or felt to be owning the CFNIS, the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service. This is not an issue that's partisan. Just in the trajectory of this one particular case, it extends across governments, and it also, with respect to the systematicity of the culture in the Canadian Forces, even precedes the government that appointed the former Chief of Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. So I think it really is at this point incumbent on us to find a way to get past the partisanship, to get to the same side of the table. In my assessment, Madam Chair, we do have adequate time. Time is tight, but we do have adequate time to really get into a discussion that would be fulsome and that would be impactful and that would allow us to prioritize those recommendations that we agree on, find a way to implement them, find a way to contextualize them, to prioritize them, and to signal to our government through a response requested from government that we are following this issue closely. This is an issue of accountability. It's an issue of democratic oversight of the Canadian Armed Forces through this very committee. It's on our shoulders as the democratic element, not the executive, but the parliamentary element that's attached to the operations of the Canadian Forces. And therefore, I think it's extremely important that we ask for a government response and that we do so as a committee that's to the greatest possible extent is nonpartisan in its orientation and approach. I think I'll leave it there for my opening remarks, Madam Chair. I have more to say, as I indicated later, to take us through some additional portions of the UK experience. And there's also then some compelling work that was done in New Zealand that I think the committee would find illuminating and helpful with respect to how we would prioritize the recommendations that are before us, or that will come before us when we proceed to finalizing our report. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Spengeman. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'd like to build on what Mr. Spengeman was saying. I do think that first and foremost in our mind should be the victims and how we're going to address what they've told us and how we're going to address the heinous behavior that they've had to face and deal with the consequences of. And I think anything short of that coming out of this committee to me would be disappointing and I think a failure of this committee to do what it should be doing, which is fighting for those victims and fighting to solve the problem of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the armed forces. And that's why I have concern and great concern about the motion that we're currently discussing that Mr. Bazan has proposed, because it doesn't allow us to accomplish that goal. I think what the motion calls for is for a report to be churned out of this committee without the necessary debate and without the necessary consensus building that is always the approach used to write a report in committees. And we've all been through that. All of us have been through that in this committee and others committees. We know how important that consensus building is, and especially on a topic that is as not just important, but I think complex and nuanced as what we're facing here. And not having the report build on being built on consensus of all the members of the committee, as is always done in committees, will not allow us to ensure that the report represents the collection of views that we have heard, whether it be from experts or from survivors or from the minister or anyone else we've heard from. And it also won't allow us, I think an important part of the debate that happens when a report is being produced by a committee is that debate, that consensus, forces members to understand, to appreciate each other's point of view, and to find a way to collectively come together and issue a report that is the best possible reflection of the joint views of the members of a committee and what they have heard and what they have concluded based on the testimony that's been put before them. Ramming it through after a couple of minutes of speaking time for each member trivializes that discussion. It eliminates that discussion, frankly, of building consensus. And that lack of consensus means we won't get that report that we need, that reflects what we've heard, that reflects the nuance and the complexity of this issue, and that ultimately presents recommendations that will allow us to make recommendations that actually solve the problem that we're here to solve, which is sexual harassment and sexual assault in the Canadian Armed Forces. So I really think we need to move to the report in the format that we always do, and we're working on reports in this Parliament, in committees, is by working by consensus. And this motion eliminates that debate, eliminates the consensus, and it basically all this motion does, if it were passed, would basically be this report would be a tick the box exercise, and that would be, I think, an incredible disservice to this issue, an incredible disservice to the survivors and what we've heard them say and what other witnesses have told us here at committee. One of the survivors that, as an example of what we heard and what parliamentarians have heard from survivors, I know many members on this committee have spoken to the fact that they've met with survivors. Survivors have come and presented to this in this Parliament, I should say, and in particular to the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. And I think we need to honor that. We need to honor their courage. We need to honor what they said, the content of what they've presented. And we don't honor that by not incorporating it into our knowledge, into the conclusions we draw, and ultimately into the report we write. And this motion would prevent us from doing that. One of the survivors who came forward, who presented to the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, is Dr. Leah West. And I want to share with you some of the things that she shared. And these are the kinds of things that I think we need to be preparing in the report, or including, I should say, in the report. And she said, with the brief time I have, I'll try to do three things. First, introduce myself and how I found myself here today. Second, identify what I believe to be the root cause of the CAF sexualized environment identified by Justice Deschamps in 2015. And third, discuss a way forward. To begin, why am I here? I served in the CAF for 10 years as an armed from Royal Military College in 2007, and immediately took command of an armored recce group One Thursday night at the end of my first year with my unit, I was sexually assaulted by a superior at a house party that was well attended by other junior officers in my regiment. At work the next day, I was ill and passed out on our squadron's bathroom floor. An ambulance and MPs arrived and took me to a civilian hospital. I did not know exactly what had happened to me the night before or why I was ill. Almost everything after the first drink was poured for me was black. But I did know where and how I woke up. I was assaulted at a house party. I don't know exactly what happened to me because everything that evening went black. But I do know where I woke up and the state I was in when I woke up. Standing over my gurney when I was taken to the emergency room were two male MPs who convinced me to have a rape kit done. I agreed, and it revealed intercourse, but no evidence of drugs. I never saw or heard from the MPs again. The following Monday, my commanding officer called me into his office. Somewhere I'd been probably only twice in my life prior to that. The MPs had informed him of what had happened. And he looked at me and asked, "How do you want me to handle this?" I didn't hesitate. I knew what I was expected to say, and I said it. "Nothing, sir." I told him that because I couldn't remember the exact details of the assault. I would modify my behavior and who I could trust. I told him not to do anything because I couldn't remember the precise details of the assault. I said that I would modify my behavior and who I could trust as though I had been raped by a superior officer in my unit. He accepted my answer and we never spoke of it again. Okay, so I want to pause there for a moment and just like let that sink in for a sec. So this survivor, Dr. Leah West, is sharing with us, shared with the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, this story of what happened to her. And this moment where she approaches her superior and after, I can't imagine what she would be feeling in the moment, but in the moment, she knew that she was not to say anything. She was not to act on what had happened to her the night before. This is part of the culture in the Canadian Armed Forces that we have heard about over and over again. And this is a real example of that. And this, we've been told at this committee, happens over and over and over again. And we're going to ignore that and take 2 minutes each to say a few things and ram a report through this committee? I'm sorry, that's not okay. And it doesn't do justice to what's happening in the armed forces right now and what's been happening for decades, forever. But here we have a situation where someone's been raped and they know, not only can they not act on what's happened to them, but they know that the culture, that the system prevents them from doing so. I want to move on with what Dr. West went on to say. 4 years later, while deployed in Afghanistan, I was investigated without my knowledge by military police in my chain of command for having a consensual sexual relationship with a US officer who was not in my unit, but of the same rank. The relationship was discovered when a male officer on my team accessed my email without my permission, found a deleted flirtatious email between me and the American, and took it to my superior. They didn't need to investigate me. The day I found out what was going on, I admitted to my boss what I had done. My relationship violated regulations against fraternization in theater. I was charged and pleaded guilty, and I was fined, repatriated from theater, and posted out of my unit. All of this I could accept. I had knowingly violated orders, and my repatriation impacted the operational effectiveness of my unit. However, what I no longer accept is that I was also called demeaning names. Told I wasn't worthy of leading soldiers, even threatened with violence by my commanding officer, and repeatedly chastised by other senior officers. For several months, I worked alone in an office with 4 workstations, managing a single Excel spreadsheet. The message was clear. My career in the regular forces was over. Eventually, when I was released, the position I had been offered with a reserve unit was revoked. The new commanding officer told me that I wasn't the type of leader he wanted in his unit. My experience is an extreme example of the double standard women in uniform face every day. So this service member who graduated at the top of her class was raped. Everyone knew the system forced her, prevented her from bringing that complaint forward. And everyone played along. Everyone who knew about it played along. And then she broke the rules and admitted to breaking the rules and immediately faced incredibly harsh consequences. Like, this is the culture of the Canadian Armed Forces. And not only was she punished, not only punished according to the rules, which she accepted, but she was mistreated and belittled and punished again. And offers of positions were withdrawn. And she was told she was not the kind of person they wanted in the Canadian Armed Forces. She's not the kind of person we want in the Canadian Armed Forces. And what about the man who raped her? What about the men who commit sexual harassment, sexual assault in the Canadian Armed Forces? Are they the type of folks that belong in the Canadian Armed Forces? Obviously not. But the only way we're going to make sure that they're not is if we solve the problem. Sorry, folks, like, that's the reality. We got to tackle this. And a tick the box report that ignores the nuance, that ignores these stories, that doesn't take into account these stories, to me, betrays that duty that we have. You know, Mr. Spengeman talked about the partisanship. Like, if anything can bring all of us in this committee together, surely this can. Surely we can rally together around this and say, we're going to produce a substantive, concrete.
I'm afraid, are you back, Mr. Baker? No, I don't think so. I think we'll have to go on to Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like for us to all remember the reasons for why we're here in this committee. We need to be responsible and show accountability to the victims. We need to move the issue forward. We need to be able to examine recommendations. We have noted that the Canadian Armed Forces had not always solved the reporting of inappropriate sexual misconduct. And so, certain victims decided not to report an incident or to remove their complaint because they were not convinced that investigations would lead to concrete results. We need to show that we are worthy of the mandate that was given to us and examine the recommendations in the report instead of calling forward additional witnesses. We also need to show that we are worthy of the courage that the witnesses and victims showed when they came to this committee. The courage needs to be present with us at all times and needs to motivate us to move forward. The Canadian Armed Forces members need to be able to report any inappropriate sexual misconduct, whether they be victims of it or witnesses of it. Any case reported needs to be investigated. There needs to be consultation with legal consultants to see if the case is a military infraction or in the criminal code. If it is determined that it is a military infraction, well, then the commandant can order an investigation in the case of unacceptable behavior. If the behavior is inappropriate and sexual and violates the criminal code, then it needs to be sent to the military police. Any forces member that has inappropriate behavior needs to be exposed to administrative measures or disciplinary measures or both, so that the Canadian Armed Forces be better protected. I think that we should examine the proposals that are not up for debate and make sense. For the recommendations that don't have unanimity, we could leave them for later. Some of my colleagues also want to speak, so I will give them the floor for now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much. Merci, Monsieur Robillard. Madame Vandenbeld, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'd like to continue where I left off in the last meeting. I know that there are significant recommendations that we have heard from witnesses, from survivors, and I would just like to reiterate once again my hope that we could still come to a consensus in this committee, that we could move to actually debating, and when I say debating, I mean really having an in-depth discussion about these incredibly important recommendations, so that we can come to a consensus, so that we can ensure that we have a report that we can not only table in Parliament and ask for a government response, but also to inform Madame Arbour's review that she is doing, because this is a very historic moment here, and I would very much hope that these important recommendations would be given the amount of time and attention and debate that they deserve to have. And just continuing with some of the recommendations that we've heard, and again, I would emphasize these are things that we've heard from the survivors. So I'll continue where I left off last time. Recommending addressing the unstated but institutionally assumed white heterosexual male norm culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think that the wording of this is very significant. The survivors that said this, unstated but institutionally assumed. And when we talk about culture, this is really what we're talking about. It's not something that is written in any kind of procedure manual or that people are told outright. It is the things that are just assumed. The things that when you join, and we heard from Professor Okros and from others about the ways in which groups in society, not just in the military, but groups in society, are able to determine who belongs, who doesn't belong, who is more important than others. And this is all done through assumptions that we make. It's done through body language. It's done through certain kinds of language that we use about each other. It's done in a way that, and as it says here, that is unstated but assumed. And then the next part I think is really important. It talks about white heterosexual male norm culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think that this is something, it's not just the Canadian Armed Forces. I think we're seeing this across institutions, particularly military or policing institutions around the world, not just here in Canada, where there has been an assumed white heterosexual male norm culture. And when you include all of those things, it's very important to understand that this isn't just about women and men. This isn't just about gender. This is about what is considered to be the normative of, as I've mentioned before, a good soldier, a good sailor, a good aviator. And those things are very much based on what has been seen before as being good and successful and valued, and what a soldier may have looked like 100 years ago. And I think that when you look at it this way, race is a big part of it. What your gender identity and sexual identity is a big part of it. And we've seen for a very long time the discrimination, and in this case, not just unstated, but overt discrimination against transgender, against gay, lesbian, LGBTQ2 plus, two-spirited, and other members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Because this normative culture, the best way of describing it is really when we're socialized, even as children, boys will be boys. And this idea of how we're socialized, girls are told to be nice. Girls are told, don't be bossy. Boys are told, be assertive, show, and then you add to that all of the intersectional layers. If you are not in the normative, whether it's because of your race, whether it's because you're Indigenous, whether it's because it's anything that is different. And that's what they mean by norm here, I think, is anything that is different. And when we say different, we're talking about different from something. The something that is different from, that is the toxic masculinity, the normative culture. When we talk about shifting culture, we're not talking about telling people that they're bad people because they have been part of a particular kind of assumption of what is normative, what is good. It is not about attacking individuals for wanting to conform to that. Because as humans, this is what we do. You join a group, and if there is a normative culture in that group, it is a natural human instinct to want to be included, to want to adapt, and in many cases, to change your behavior and your interactions with people in order not to be an outsider, in order not to be excluded. And we have seen that with many, many people who, whether it's women, whether it's racialized Canadians, whether it's LGBT, where in order to be included, they will, and we, all of us, I think, have had groups where we feel like we are on the outside, where we don't call things out, we try to fit in. And the question is, what are we fitting into? Changing culture is about changing what are we fitting into. And if that thing that is the norm, that is the inclusion, if that is welcoming of who you are as an identity, if you can come into a group and feel that the way that the culture of that group is in such a way that those small things that tell you whether you belong or not, you feel like they include you. You feel like it is something where you are part of it, and you don't have to adapt. You don't have to self-censor. You don't have to change your behavior, your language, what you say, what you don't say, what you speak out on or don't speak out on. If there is a inclusive, welcoming culture, then every identity, every person, regardless of whether they seem to be different than what the majority in that group has been traditionally, will feel like they have a place in that group. And that then will become a self-fulfilling thing, because as you bring more people in with different backgrounds, different assumptions, different ideas, different diverse people who do things differently, and they are welcomed, that will then, of course, cause the culture to then become even more inclusive, so that the next people that come in will find themselves reflected in the normative. So this is why I don't think we can divorce what's happening with sexual misconduct from what's happening with white supremacy and racism and homophobia and anything that is causing harm and hatred and exclusion. I don't think these can be divorced from one another, because we have heard, and we've heard this many, many times, that this is not about sex, it's about power. And it is about the power of people who want to maintain a culture the way it is, to exclude others and to keep that hierarchy in the way that it has always been. And asserting power, when somebody experiences sexual harassment, a sexual joke, if somebody's experiencing all of the ways in which you get diminished because of your identity, that's not about sex, that's about abuse of power. And what makes it worse in hierarchical structures like the military, like policing services, in places where there is a very, very strong hierarchy of power, what makes it worse is that the person who is abusing the power already has significant power over the person who is not as high as them in the chain of command. And that is why when we talk about changing culture, we're not talking about just saying these people have been bad and we need to I mean, obviously there are cases where people need to be punished. Obviously there are cases where we can't have impunity for really significant abuses of power. But it's also about changing all those small ways in which people interact day to day. So I think that this particular recommendation that links the intersectionality, that talks about the white heterosexual male normative culture, is one of the single most important recommendations. And as we discuss these recommendations, which I hope we will actually get a chance to really discuss, not just 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, and then a vote. I really hope that we get a chance to sit and have, as parliamentarians, a real back and forth discussion about what these recommendations mean and why are they important and what is it that we want, Madame, our board to be looking into. I believe that parliamentarians have an incredibly important role to play in saying what it is that we, based on all of our testimony, based on the people who took time out of their lives, and in some cases, very difficult testimony, to come to us on the assumption that we would then be able to take that and put it forward and request a government response. And I'd like to just, I've got more recommendations, but for one moment, talk about the cynicism behind a committee, and this is in that motion, putting forward a set of recommendations and a study and all of the material that we have in that study, and then not asking for a government response. The whole purpose is to make sure these things are acted on. So for a committee to not want the government to respond to our report, I can only assume that the underlying desire is not to have recommendations for the government to act on, to actually implement, but something else. And I really hope that it isn't cynical. I really hope that we can actually get to these reports. And I would remind the members of the committee that, you know, if we were to even be able to adjourn debate or adjourn this meeting, that would give us a chance to get to the report immediately and be able to actually start to debate these recommendations the way they should be debated. And I'll go through some of the other things that we've heard, Madam Chair, because we've heard some really, really compelling testimony. And I can say, you know, I've been in the role of Parliamentary Secretary for National Defence now for over a year. And I can say that I have learned more in this position in the last, I guess, year or 16 months that I've been in this role than I have in any job I've ever had in my life. I have learned more. And I want to be clear for those veterans and members of the Canadian Armed Forces who are listening and watching, I see the incredible desire to serve. I see the good. I see members of the military who are willing to sacrifice everything for the good of our country, for the good of our neighbors, for the good of other people, to make sure we live in a world that is better, that is more peaceful, that is more stable, to make sure those that would do us harm are not given the opportunity to do us harm. People who sacrifice their family, and I can tell you that my husband grew up in a military family. My husband's family were in the Air Force. And you want to talk about gender discrimination. My husband's parents, his mother and father, met in the Air Force. They were both. His mother was a meteorologist in the Air Force. And they met, they married, they moved around as many people do. And as soon as she got pregnant with my husband, and we're talking about 1962. 1962, this is in many of our lifetimes, she had to quit the Air Force because she was pregnant. She was not allowed to stay in the Air Force in 1962 because she was pregnant with a child. So she left the Air Force and became a military spouse and spent the rest of her career as the trailing spouse, following her husband's career. My father-in-law, he stayed in the Air Force, and they moved to Germany, and they were in Zweibrücken, they lived in Cold Lake, they lived in Comox. It's the same lifestyle. My husband is very proud of that history. He joined the cadets. He got a gliding scholarship, in fact, after his father died, he had to, of course, return to Ottawa Valley, where the family was from. I think that the sacrifices that are made by military families are not known to a lot of people. I don't think they realize the roots. My husband was 20 years old, returning back to a place, the Ottawa Valley, that he had never really lived in, grandparents that he only knew on holidays. And, the sacrifices that are made by the members of our Canadian Armed Forces so that they can protect us, so that they can do good. I think that we cannot lose track of that when we're talking about this. And I'm looking at you, Madam Chair, and I do want to acknowledge here in the committee 31 years of service that you gave to this country. And I have to say that for those people who are willing to do that, who are willing to give their lives, who are willing to go into danger to keep us from harm, we owe it to them that their work environment is safe. We owe it to them that when they put that uniform on, when they go to places like Bosnia and Kosovo and Afghanistan, and I've lived in Bosnia and Kosovo, and I can tell you that my life was only safe because of the military, the Canadian Armed Forces, and the other NATO forces that were there in the corner. When I lived in Sarajevo, there were 20,000 NATO troops in and around Sarajevo at that time. And I could not have been there or been safe in the work I was doing to promote democracy and anti-corruption. I could not have done that without those 20,000 NATO troops. And at that time, they were under Canadian command. And I don't know that young Canadians know how incredibly grateful the people of the Balkans are. I lived in Kosovo at the time that they declared independence. And I can tell you that if you were Canadian or British or American, people were walking in the streets with old men, wrinkled faces, tears running down their face, holding the hand of their young 5 or 6 year old grandchild. And they would see us as Canadians, and they would start to cry and say, because of you, my grandchild will not know violence. My grandchild will live in freedom, and it's because of you. And I don't know that Canadians know that. Our Canadian Armed Forces put themselves in harm's way so that people can live in freedom, so that we can live. My family are from the Netherlands. My father, who passed away just before Christmas, my father got his first candy from a Canadian soldier in his city in the Netherlands in 1945. In 1945. He was born in 1940. He lived in a city. He was still afraid of airplanes the day he died because he knew that airplanes meant that the bombs would drop. When he came out of the cellar, he knows the word cellar, by the way, an English word. He was 5 years old. He did not know any English. But he and his younger brother, when they were hiding in the cellar, and the fighting was going on, and the Canadian Armed Forces had gone into the city that he was living, led by the way, this is one of those wonderful synchronicities in life, the scout, who was the head of intelligence, who was the first Canadian to cross the river into the city that my dad was living, where his grandfather and great-grandfather and uncles were in the Dutch resistance. And they made contact. That was the man that we grew up next to. He was our next door neighbor. And we knew that Ernie Dombrowski was his name. And I'll be honest, Ernie was a bit of a curmudgeon-y man. You know, he was an older guy. We were little kids. We probably made lots of noise and played ball, and the ball ended up in his yard, and he was a little grumpy. And my father said to us, "You show respect to Ernie. You always respect Ernie because he saved us. He was the first Canadian into Daventer, the city my father and his family were living in, the first Canadian soldier to make contact with his own family who were in the resistance and to pave the way for the liberation." And what happened at that liberation is my dad's family were hiding. My dad was the oldest, and they heard silence. And of course, the children didn't want to stay in the small cellar, so they came out. And they came out into the street, and there were Canadian soldiers. And the soldiers said, "Cellar, cellar." My dad didn't know what the word meant, but he knew that the fighting wasn't over, and it was still dangerous, and they had to get back in that cellar. And when they were finally able to get out of that cellar and go out into the streets, my dad, he would talk about this till the day he died. He talked about the fact that he came out and they saw the Canadian soldiers and they saw the tanks, and they were throwing, this might not be so good in modern days, but they were throwing cigarettes to the parents, and they were throwing candies to the children. And he would talk about the candy, this little, I think it must have probably been a Werther's original, because he said it was a hard candy that was kind of like caramel with a golden wrapper. And he took this candy. In 5 years, he'd never had candy. The Dutch they barely had enough to eat. I mean, they talked about when they would scoop the butter, they would get more and more butter because they had so many breadcrumbs that they would try to make butter by keeping the breadcrumbs in the butter. They had nothing. And he'd never had a candy. And this soldier gave him a candy, and he remembered that for the rest of his life. And Madam Chair, if you'll allow me, recently I went to a seniors home in my riding, and it was a 100th birthday party. And the gentleman, sharp man at 100 years old, I said thank you, because he had been a Canadian soldier, and he had been, in the discussion I had with him, he had been in Daventer, in the town that my dad was from. And I almost in tears thanked him. I said, I am here. I am here because of you. I am here in Canada. I am here as a member of Parliament. I am alive because of those soldiers. And when my father, when this old man who was turning 100 years old, when we started to talk, I said, "Did you know Ernie Dombrowski?" And he says, "Ernie Dombrowski? He was my boss. I worked with him." And I realized at that moment, and this was his birthday, so there were all kinds of candies on the table. And they had these little packages like at weddings, those little, where they have the candies in a little ribbon. And he takes, 100 years old, this man, he takes this candy, this little package with the ribbon on it, and he hands it to me. And he says, "Madam Anita, will you please take this candy and give it to your father?" And that afternoon, an hour later, I went home to my parents, and I went to my dad, and this was just a year ago. This was just not long before he died. And I walked up to my dad and I gave him that candy, and I said, "No." And he had tears in his eyes. He said, "Now, Anita, it's the second time in my life that I have a candy from a Canadian soldier, and it could even well be the same one." And so the point that I'd like to make, and I have a lot more recommendations to go through, but I'd let my colleagues speak for a little while. The point that I'd like to make is that we owe it to the people who sacrifice what they do. We owe it to them to make sure that they are safe. We owe it to them to make sure that they have an environment where they can give their all and never for 1 second feel like they don't belong. Because not only do they belong in the military, in the Canadian Armed Forces, but they are the reason that we are here. And I hadn't intended, Madam Chair, to go off on all of those stories, but it's something I feel very profoundly. And I think that it is very, very important that our committee realize the gravity and the importance and the seriousness of what we're talking about today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madame Vanderbilt. As soon as I get the tears out of my eyes, we'll continue. So on to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yeah, I too was quite moved by those stories from Ms. Vanderbilt, and it reminds me of what an honorable career that the military is for Canadians, and what they have done and what they aspire to do, and that we should be just working to make sure that it remains an honorable career, but safe at the same time. And I have to, as I've often done at these meetings, compliment Mr. Baker for really bringing us back to the central focus that we should be on. And I know all members of the committee want to improve the armed forces, and I'm sure they're thinking, as we're debating with this, bringing in new material that's important for the report and the information from the survivors and the experts. I'm sure all committee members are thinking, you know, what recommendations should deal with these complex problems, the complex problems of, as I've said, and Mr. Baker said at the beginning of most meetings, the three fundamental problems, at least, of culture change, of the fear of reporting, partly because of the role of the chain of command, and the fear of reprisals, which I talked about in the last meeting, to reporting. You know, if you've picked such an honorable career, why would you want a reprisal to affect you in that career? And so I compliment everyone that is going to speak today for you know, there's been very courageous women in Quebec and the rest of Canada brought forward these stories, and Mr. Baker mentioned one of them. And so I compliment every committee member today that will speak about how we can deal with the complex issues and the problems that have resulted in thousands of misappropriate actions in the military, dealing with the three items that I just mentioned. So I will later, and not right now, but later on, I want to go through, as I said, my role, my position on those recommendations that I think would help work on these very complex and serious problems that I mentioned, that obviously the members, that present members and potential future members of the military, and sometimes D&D, really want addressed. Solutions that will deal with, you know, the thousands of people involved in the military and D&D. So I will talk about those recommendations later. I just want to, my intervention will be short, this one. I'll save my other information for later, but I just wanted to add, as we've said, we've had many experts and additions to help us formulate those recommendations. And I just want to add, I'm only going to read a paragraph here, but it's a report of the unmaking of militarized masculinity. And I'm just going to, at the moment, it's a long report. It's, I don't know, well over 10 fine print pages, which I'm not going to read at this time. I'm just going to read the abstract so that people at least have a reference to it as they think about what recommendations we should do. And it's written by Sarah Bulmer and Maya Eichler from the Department of Politics, University of Exeter, Penguin, UK, Political Studies and Women's Studies, and the Canada Research Chair in Social Innovation and Community Engagement, Mount St. Vincent University, Halifax, Nova Scotia. And so the one paragraph abstract is that feminist scholarship on war and militarization has typically focused on making of militarized masculinity. However, in this article, we shed light on the process of unmaking militarized masculinity through the experiences of veterans transitioning from military to civilian life. We argue that in the 21st century, veterans' successful reintegration into civilian society is integral to the legitimacy of armed forces in Western politics and is therefore a central concern of policymakers, third sector service providers, and the media. But the militarized masculinity is not easily unmade. I think everyone on the committee would agree with that. They may have an ambivalent relationship with the state and the military. Furthermore, militarized masculinity is embodied and experienced and has a long and contradictory afterlife in veterans themselves. Attempts to unmake militarized masculinity in the figure of the veteran challenge some of the key concepts currently employed by feminist scholars of war and militarization. In practice, embodied veteran identities refuse a totalizing conception of what militarized masculinity might be and demonstrate the limits of efforts to exceptionalize the military as opposed to the civilian aspects of veteran identity. In turn, the very liminality of this unmaking troubles and undoes neat categorizations of military/civilian and their implied masculine/feminine gendering. We suggest that an excessive focus on the making of militarized masculinity has limited our capacity to engage with dynamic, co-constitutive, and contradictory processes which shape veterans' post-military lives. And I won't get into the rest of that report at this time. But
Mr. Bagnall, we've lost your feed there. Reselect me, unmute and mute. Try it again. There you go.
okay,
There you go.
sorry, somehow I got muted. So what I wanted to do before going into a lengthy paper, or as I said later, to go into all the recommendations I would have, is talk about a way we might be able to get some things forward fairly quickly. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but from the experts and from the victims that we've heard from, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from Mr. Baker. Obviously, the facts are the facts, the situation is the situation, and there are certain things that come up over and over again that is obviously should be done, or that have been suggested by the experts and the survivors that should be done. And I think because of our common cause and the common facts that have come up in this way at great length, that there should be a number of things that we can all agree on. I mean, what reports reflect is what the witnesses said. So it's pretty hard to disagree with that in the report. And recommendations have evolved from what the witnesses and the experts have told us. So there should be a lot of that we could come to agreement on. So one way we might, like I said, I'm just thinking about off the top of my head. I'm looking forward to hearing what other people think of this idea. I'm not sure exactly how to word it yet, but if we were to go through recommendations and very quickly, like one at a time, and just have a vote as to whether it could be dealt with in the way Mr. Bazan has proposed. If there's unanimous consent on each particular motion, on those motions, and I think there should be, personally, I think there should be a lot of them that we can all agree on, then we would deal with it in the way that Mr. Bazan has outlined in his motion. And we get through all those things relatively quickly, and have things to show. And then the difficult ones that we can't all agree on to have a quick decision on, then we could go into debating those. My assumption, but I might be wrong, is that there's a lot of things we can agree on. But there are obviously, as there always is in situations at committees, a number of items that need some, more detailed debate on. So I will just leave that idea, that proposal, to quickly go through all the recommendations, find out unanimously what we could agree on to do through Mr. Bazan's proposal of a couple of minutes per committee member. We get the list of those, take care of those recommendations, and then what's left that we couldn't agree on to deal with quickly, we would then debate at length. That way we would have some production, some answers for the victims relatively quickly. And then we'd have other things that we would be debating more at length. So I'll just leave that suggestion forward. And that's one of the reasons I didn't want to go into all my suggestions or recommendations or a lengthy report right now, because I wanted to make that possible way of everyone moving forward together to help the victims. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Bagnall. On to Mr. Spengeman, please.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all my colleagues for preceding interventions, and in particular Ms. Vandenbelt for very personal reflections on the role of the Canadian Forces and the powerful sentiments that she put behind her illustration, her arguments. As we come up on the 76th anniversary of D-Day celebrations this weekend, I think it's incredibly important that we all reflect on the contributions of the Canadian Armed Forces, the historic contributions, the current and future ones, including our important peacekeeping operations that we're part of today and operations through NATO. And perhaps maybe I can just suggest the argument to the committee that there are two components to the issue that we're dealing with, the issue of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Forces. One is a moral component, in the sense that it is simply wrong, it is flat wrong for this behavior to be present, to continue. All members of the Canadian Forces have a right to serve in a safe, secure manner, free from bullying, harassment, assault, any kind of misconduct. The other consideration, and I'm going to be careful to in terms of where to position it, the moral component is the most important component. But the other consideration is an operational consideration that affects the Canadian Forces, and in a broader sense, Madam Chair, affects every army, every force within the set of our allies and friends that's currently working with us across the world. And it's the question of trust. The trust in the Canadian Forces has very quickly and very fundamentally eroded through this ongoing issue of sexual misconduct, and amplified by the two cases, the prominent cases that we're studying. If members of the Canadian Forces can't trust each other, all the cultural components that we consider valuable in terms of the culture of excellence, the culture of service, the culture of camaraderie, looking out for one's fellow member of the Canadian Forces on the battlefield and in the halls of Defence Headquarters in Ottawa, become eroded very quickly. So this mistrust that's driven by the culture of sexual misconduct has wider ripples inside the Canadian Forces. And we're all following the news headlines closely and need to look not much beyond them to see the impact of this. And it also erodes the effectiveness of organizations like NATO, many of whose militaries are struggling with the same issue. So there is a defense component, there is an operational component to this. And Ms. Vandenbelt was spot on when she mentioned the questions of supremacy, racism, homophobia, and other drivers of exclusion, of division that manifest themselves here in Canada and elsewhere in the world as being incredibly relevant to the work that we're currently doing. That's why the reference to this committee's previous work in the 42nd Parliament on diversity and inclusion is important. That's why the report of Mr. Justice Fish is important. Questions with respect to military justice are important. So we're facing with a large systemic problem that has a fundamental moral component, but also a very prominent and potentially very worrisome operational component. Restoring trust takes time. Restoring trust takes an admission that we have an issue, an admission that many of our witnesses have very openly made, including the minister when he spoke to us for 6 hours, acknowledging that we are not meeting the expectations, that we're not protecting serving women in the Canadian Forces is an incredibly important first step. And I think that acknowledgement is there across party lines and across levels of service and government. But then the follow-up is where the rubber really hits the road, and where this committee, in terms of parliamentary accountability, needs to do its work. That's why we need to look closely to the work of Madam Justice Arbour. She is an independent authority who's been given a mandate with great urgency and great scope. But we need to complement that as the parliamentary accountability mechanism to the Canadian public. We're elected, we're members of this committee, and the expectation of the Canadian public is to us to come out and to take steps and make recommendations that will heal the trust that's been eroded, that's been broken. That takes time, but in the minister's words, the time for patience is over. We need to act now, and we need a complete culture change. So with that in mind, Madam Chair, I would like to just take the opportunity to finish, I think, an important section of the experience that our British friends and colleagues have identified and reported on with respect to dealing with inappropriate behavior when it occurs in the armed forces. And their conclusion, like ours, is that we have to do better. Their report focused on how they can improve the response to incidents when they do occur, judging in particular that they need to build trust and confidence in the complaint system, improve reporting of inappropriate behavior, and the support of those who are affected. Governance structures are proposed, new governance structures that provide stronger centralized oversight and support, a single point of reference for data on inappropriate behavior, coupled with the ability to identify and share leading practice across the organization, and offering alternatives and potentially anonymous pathways for raising concerns of inappropriate behavior or service complaints. And very interestingly, the British report says this is the experience of the Canadian Armed Forces and the Australian Defence Force. In this part of the report, we will recommend the establishment of a new central organization. In the UK, it's called the Defence Authority, that is responsible for cultures and inappropriate behaviors. We will also recommend in parallel a review of the service complaints process. So to the extent that we still have cases, pending cases that are not reported yet, dealing with inappropriate behavior when it does occur is of fundamental importance in the UK as it is here in the restoration of trust. It's only one component, but it's an important one. A common theme among organizations who had faced endemic behavioral problems with respect to sexual misconduct was a very low level of initial reporting, often combined with the perception that all was well. We're far beyond this point in Canada, but that was the insight gained from the British experience. It was only when a significant event prompted further in-depth investigation that the extent of the issue became apparent, and it's clear to us, Madam Chair, as members of this committee, what those events were in the recent weeks. The majority of cases found in the evidence we looked at from Australia, Canada, and the private sector pointed to a general lack of confidence to report inappropriate behavior for several reasons. And before I cite them, I want to just point out to the committee that the reference to Canada in the British report is footnoted to the ERA and the Madame Deschamps report of 2015. These reasons are the following. Fear of adverse consequences on the complainant's career, fear of not being believed, belief that nothing would be done, and a lack of transparency in the outcome or complaint, inadequate or insufficient consequences or disciplinary action, complaint processes not independent of the chain of command or line management, lack of anonymity for the complainant, and lastly, the amount taken to achieve resolution. And the conclusion in the British report is that a number of complaints of inappropriate behavior is underreported in the service complaint system for similar or identical reasons. And they make the following observation. The service complaints target is to resolve 90% of all complaints within 24 weeks. In 2018, the Service Complaints Ombudsman reported only 50% of complaints were resolved in 24 weeks. we found the average target in the private sector for the resolution of complaints of inappropriate sexual behavior being 40 to 45 days. So very important discrepancies. And as you can see, Madam Chair, this the UK really took a sweeping look at the issue and all the way over into the private sector, which is really the parallel that we're concerned about. And that helps us in line with efforts that are going on in the private sector to identify those additional constraints that we face within the Canadian Forces with respect to the reporting structure and the chain of command and other factors. The private sector reports an average number of complaints of inappropriate behavior equating approximately 1% of the workforce per year, of which 25 to 40% is usually reported anonymously. By comparison, the Service Complaints Ombudsman report in 2018 reported that the services received a total of 1,185 complaints, of which 763 were deemed admissible and only 190, or 25%, were related to bullying, discrimination, and harassment. This represents less than 0.1 of the strength of the service. And this low reporting rates of inappropriate behavior has been attributed to the issues that we just talked about, chain of command and others. And the report goes on to take a look at US data from 2016, citing that the United States Department of Defense estimated that only 7% of those who experienced sexual assault came forward to report the incident to the military. In 2018, this rate was approximately 30%. Other common reasons included concerns that reporting would negatively affect career prospects, that nothing would be done, that confidentiality would not be kept because service women blame themselves, work concerns, environmental concerns, differential treatment by leadership, and a perception that complainants would be seen as weak. All of these factors go to the question of trust. If people cannot trust the complaint system, it is a fundamental driver of the overall implication of mistrust with respect to the Canadian Forces, the UK Armed Forces in this case, but by extension the Canadian Forces as an employer. And most importantly, in an environment where trust is fundamental to the operational effectiveness and also to the safety of the women and men that serve. If you cannot trust the person next to you, you're not going to be an effective member, and the entire units and by extension the entire forces will be ineffective. The UK recommended that defence should consider a call for evidence on inappropriate behaviour in conjunction with a sexual harassment survey in 2021, and I think it would probably be valuable for us as a committee to have an exchange on that recommendation and the implications here in Canada. There's also thoughts on anonymous reporting as an essential component to restoring trust. The report states that while some people will feel able to report incidents of inappropriate behavior through their chain of command or line management, many will not. In the United States, Australia, and New Zealand Armed Forces, they've utilized a restricted reporting method, allowing an individual to seek support for a sexual assault without initiating an investigation, thus remaining anonymous. The U.S. restricted reporting data is compelling in that all victims indicated that they would not have reported if the only means had been through a formal report. In 2017, 24% of those reporting went on to convert to a full report initiating an investigation. Key to this is that the report must be recorded to enable an understanding of the level of incidents. Internal employee support networks provide valuable assistance, but are not the answer. The Army Sexual Harassment Survey in 2018 recommended the introduction of a web-based anonymous reporting tool for inappropriate behaviors so that service personnel can make the Army aware of these behaviors without fear of repercussion. And in the UK, Madam Chair, this initiative is not yet resourced. So the Wixton report makes a recommendation to resource, develop, and implement an anonymous tool for reporting inappropriate behaviors across defense. I raised this portion of the report again to highlight the importance of finding a pathway to effectively empower members of the Canadian Forces to report inappropriate behavior. We're not at the stage yet where we can assume that no further incidents will happen or that no further reports will come. The fact that we had two cases back-to-back directly implicating the former Chiefs of Defence staff shows the systemic entrenchment of the issues. We're not at the stage yet where we can say even that there's a particular amount of light at the end of the tunnel. In parallel with that, as I've indicated in previous submissions, and as structurally incorporated in the UK report, is the importance of finding ways to encourage this kind of behavior from never happening in the first place. And these were my submissions and recommendations based on their experience with respect to training, feedback loops, innovative new mechanisms like reverse mentorship. In short, there's a lot of work to be done on the question of trust. It takes time to restore it. The urgency is incredibly high. It will not be fixed tomorrow, but we have to start tomorrow, if not today. And I think that's the message that we heard from the minister, that really the time for patience is over. And again, the issue of trust is an operational component as much as it is a reflection of the moral breakdown that for far too long has gone on in the Canadian forces and so many other forces across the world because of the failure to take account of the role of women in the forces and the right of women and all genders to serve in the forces. So the challenge is monumental. The pivot point is trust, both with respect to the moral implications and the operational implications. And thinking forward, Madam Chair, if we look at just our friends and allies within NATO who are suffering this issue in various degrees, but systemically, unless we get on top of this, the operational effectiveness of the alliance can and potentially will be called into question, in addition to the fact that we are facing a wrong that we are not righting. And that's why I'm so emphatic on the point that the responsibility is on the shoulders of this committee to do this work now. And in the few sessions that we have left, we can do it. I think Mr. Bagnall's proposal is an excellent one, that we can find those recommendations that we can get behind. We can have a discussion focused and short on how to prioritize them, how to connect them to each other, what kind of sequence we need to set up to make sure that these recommendations are mutually reinforcing and that they can cross-leverage also the work that Madam Justice Arbour is doing in parallel. So huge amount of work in front of us. The most important issue, in my view, that this committee has faced in recent history, but a runway to achieve something that will add value to the future of the Canadian Forces. I will turn it back to you on this thought, Madam Chair. I still have a couple of more things before I will finish my remarks on the Wixton report, and if there's time, I will briefly comment on the follow-up report that the UK put into place a year later, that's really just a year ago for us now, that led to some very interesting and innovative conclusions and also additional recommendations that identified some gaps in Wixton that did not work. I think we have to turn our mind to the possibility of doing that here as well. If we put forward some recommendations, they get implemented, and a year later it turns out that they're not quite the right emphasis, or recommendations have to be changed, altered, resequenced. What kind of mechanisms can we propose to the Government of Canada to make sure that we have that flexibility, that adaptability, to make sure that whatever gets put in place doesn't just get held out as investment X and we've approached the problem. And there's also a need to follow up and make sure it actually works and delivers the results in longer term. And the fact that the UK was able to do that within a year suggests that a government of a member state of NATO should have that flexibility and does have that flexibility. So an additional thought for the committee's deliberation. And with that, Madam Chair, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spengeman.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wonder if the Liberal members would do the rest of the members of the committee the courtesy of letting us know how long they intend to carry on this filibuster, which obstructs the work of the committee, and if in fact they do intend to carry it on for the remainder of this parliamentary session and prevent us from dealing with the question of accountability for how the sexual misconduct complaints of General Vance were dealt with. It would be useful for members of the committee to know that they do intend to continue this obstruction indefinitely. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison. Go ahead, Madame Van Vel.
If I may, I would encourage, if the opposition were willing to adjourn the debate right now, we could go directly to those reports right now. If they adjourn the debate or allow the chair to adjourn the meeting, the next item of business would be the reports. And I think we would all be very, very happy to be able to do that right now.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
It's clear there's no rule of this committee preventing gaslighting, but the Parliamentary Secretary engages in this all the time. All that's necessary for us to go to
Mr. Garrison.
All that's necessary, I have the floor, all that's necessary for us to move to a vote on this resolution is for the Liberals to stop filibustering.
And Mr. Garrison, we don't call people names or make personal attacks. You can disagree with someone's approach, with their understanding, with what their priorities are, and that's all fine. But I don't agree with
Madam
the
Chair.
Yes.
Madam Chair, the Liberal side has continued to question the motives of all other members of the committee. I brought it to your attention in the previous meeting, which I was present, continued to dismiss our concerns as partisanship. And so I would say that that's the concern about calling names and attributing motives starts on the Liberal side. I attributed no motives to why the Liberals are conducting their filibuster. They can answer for that in public.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Garrison. So we are done then with Mr. Spengeman. You're done. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I have to say that Mr. Garrison did attach motives when he spoke a moment ago to his allegation that, and when he said that the Liberal members were not willing to ensure accountability. And so very clearly that's implying motive. As far as the calling of names, I think it's really disappointing. And I think Mr. Garrison unfortunately missed the last meeting when members of the government side shared a tremendous amount of, I think, important information. And perhaps it's because he missed that, doesn't have that context that he feels the way he does in this moment, but a tremendous amount of important information was shared by the members on the government side about why we feel the way we do and why we want a process that ensures a proper report is written that that really addresses the issue of sexual harassment, sexual assault in the Canadian Armed Forces and does justice to the survivors. So I appreciate that maybe that context was something that Mr. Garrison missed and therefore perhaps explains why he feels the way he does. That said, what I wanted to do was I wanted to continue with...
Point d'ordre, Madame la Présidente.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Ludval?
J'aimerais savoir si vous pourriez nous...
I would like to know if you could tell us if we're allowed to make reference to the absence of a member during a committee meeting.
I would say no. I believe they follow basically the same rules in the House as here in the committee.
Then, Madam Chair, I apologize for breaching that rule. I wasn't aware that I couldn't do that. I know that members' presence is registered in the minutes, and thus I thought it was permissible to refer to it, but I didn't mean to breach the rule, and I apologize for doing that. That said, I just thought that the context from the last meeting is important to consider to understand why the Liberal members are saying what they're saying here today, and why we're continuing to debate this motion. So with that said, I want to continue where I left off when the unfortunately my internet connection cut out as I was speaking in the initial intervention, and so what I wanted to do was continue where I left off, as I think the members will recall. What was happening what I was speaking about at that time was I was relaying the experience, the testimony that was shared by Dr. Leah West to our colleagues at the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, and it was she was relaying an experience during her time as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. She spoke about how she was sexually assaulted, how there was tremendous pressure that she felt that she could not speak up, could not file a complaint about that issue, and then later was being treated, was punished for something that for a rule that she broke, and she acknowledged that she broke that rule, but then subsequently faced various forms of what I would call bullying and abuse and broader mistreatment by a number of members of the Canadian Armed Forces. She faced punishment for what she had done wrong. She speaks in her testimony to the fact that she understood she broke the rule, that she admitted to breaking the rule. But what I think is reprehensible is how she was treated when she brought forward, when she wanted to bring forward but couldn't bring forward her complaint about being assaulted, sexually assaulted, while on duty. I want to continue from Dr. West's testimony, and that I had started, which relayed what I've just shared with you. She said, my biggest failure in life, actions for which I was pushed out of the Armored Corps and for which I continue to carry immense shame is, however, allegedly precisely the type of leadership displayed by the man who ultimately served as this country's longest serving chief of defense staff. Yet for me as a female Army captain, there was no hesitation to act on an email and remove me from my position. And that was the right call. We cannot turn a blind eye when military leaders put themselves and their interests before the mission. This ethical obligation is the foundation upon which any professional military operates. Serve Canada before self. This brings me to my second point. Where does this double standard come from? Why is sexual misconduct so prolific and even condoned in the Canadian Armed Forces when the victims are women, but not the wrongdoers? In my opinion, the sexualized environment identified in the Deschamps report is a symptom of two more fundamental issues at the core of the Canadian Armed Forces culture. First, women and men and their contributions to the Canadian Armed Forces are not valued and respected equally. Second, the Canadian Armed Forces continues to perpetuate deeply flawed and antiquated expectations about who women and men in the armed forces are supposed to be, and correspondingly how they ought to behave. So I want to pause there on what Dr. West said, and explain to the committee why I've shared it with you. She talks about this double standard. She says, why is sexual misconduct so prolific and even condoned in the Canadian Armed Forces when the victims are women, but not the wrongdoers? And she talks about the Deschamps report, and she talks about it being that the sexualized environment is a symptom of the Canadian Armed Forces culture. And the first element of that, she says, is women and men and their contributions to the CAF not being valued and respected equally. And the second part of that is that the CAF continues to perpetuate deeply flawed and antiquated expectations about who women and men in the armed forces are supposed to be and how they have to behave. So I wanted to underline that part of Dr. West's testimony, because she's speaking to, these are precisely the types of insights that we need as part of a report. And these are the types of insights that if the current motion were to pass, that Mr. Bazan proposed, being debated right now, if that motion were to pass, they wouldn't make it, because this is something that is incredibly nuanced, something that has to be discussed, something to be thought about, and we have to think as a committee and discuss and align on, come to consensus on what recommendations we're going to make to act on these problems that Dr. West and so many others have raised. Can't do that in 2 minutes. I'm sorry, you just can't. And that's what the current motion calls for. So, I highlight this because it's a problem, and then broadly speaking, Dr. West is talking about the broader culture, and you don't need to have personal experience in this. I'm sure many of the members of the committee do, but we've heard from many witnesses. We know from the Deschamps report. We know from others who we've heard from. My colleague, Mr. Bagnall, speaks about this very knowledgeably and regularly at this committee about, the importance of culture, the role that culture plays in driving this problem, and how culture has to be addressed to solve it. I don't think there's any debate about that. The question is, how do you do it? And that's complex. That's hard. And anyone who's been involved in culture change in any shape or form, whether in driving that culture change or in being part of an organization where culture change is being undertaken by the organization, knows it's incredibly difficult and incredibly complex. And so I think, I just think, we really need to take the time to understand what aspects of culture are the problem, and then to come to think about and come to consensus on in our report, but how we're going to tackle those various components of the problem within culture change that Dr. West is speaking about in her testimony, and then how we're actually going to tackle each of those. That, I mean, to me, that's what the report should be doing. That's what this committee needs to be doing. I think if we don't do that, if we don't tackle culture change in our report in this way, that, in terms of identifying the problem, the components of the problem, and then recommending solutions, then we're failing as a committee. We're failing as MPs. We should be trying to solve this problem and honoring, people like Dr. West and others who've had the courage to come forward and speak to parliamentarians and speak in public and share their experiences, so that we can solve these problems. And the current motion is basically wouldn't allow us to do that. And I just don't understand how we could allow a motion like that to move forward. So Dr. West goes on that train of thought. Dr. West goes on to say, how do we fix it? And she says, given the time, I'll simply identify 3 recommendations. First, as we all know, we need an independent reporting mechanism. The government, I believe, should make interim policy and legislative changes to expand the mandate of the Sexual Misconduct Response Center to include independent investigations. This can happen concurrently with the review by Justice Arbour. Okay. That's the first thing. Second, so she's talking about independent reporting mechanism. Secondly, I'm quoting from Dr. West's testimony. Second, we must improve leadership training and officer cadet mentorship at the Royal Military College. The RMC is the training ground of our future leaders, but it is also where these outdated, degrading perceptions of men and women in the forces take root. And I think that that's something that the second point that Dr. West has raised is something that we've heard about from a number of witnesses, especially at the beginning of the study, when we heard from a number of witnesses who are really experts in this area, and who really spoke to how the culture that permeates this culture that needs to be addressed, that permeates the Canadian Armed Forces, begins not just within the Canadian Armed Forces themselves, within the formal organization when members start to serve, but at the Royal Military College. Like, it's part of how members or future members of the armed forces are brought into the forces. And no wonder it permeates the forces. I mean, from day one, not just day one in the forces, day one of the education of the and within the Royal Military College, we're told these degrading, and these are Dr. West's words, these outdated, degrading perceptions of men and women in the forces take root. So I think that piece of it, of how we're going to address culture change, not just within the forces, but within the Royal Military College, and the training and education that it provides to future members, needs to be addressed in our report. I want to go on, though, with Dr. West's testimony. Finally, she says, I believe the notion of zero tolerance for all forms of misconduct is unrealistic and unhelpful. Culture change in the Canadian Armed Forces is a massive undertaking. Good people trying to do better will make mistakes. The cost of making those mistakes cannot be so severe that victims and observers hesitate to speak up and take action. So, Dr. West is talking about, and this is a really important nuance, right? This is an important nuance. She's talking about it. First of all, she reaffirms what I was saying a few moments ago about culture change being a massive undertaking. And so, 2 minutes per MP speaking to a report, that's not going to get us to a report that allows us to undertake this massive undertaking of culture change, obviously. But she also makes us another point. You know, she talks about, you know, good people trying to do better will make mistakes. And so she's talking about a subtle element of this, but I think that's an element that has to be brought into our thinking and has to be brought into our report. It has to be reflected in our report and our recommendation. I'm sorry, that point, to the extent that the members agree with it, perhaps there are members here who don't agree with it, but that's a discussion we should have if we don't agree with it. And if we do all agree with it, we need to take the time to make sure it makes it in there. And there's no way in our 2 minutes we're going to be able to make the time to get it in there. And that's why I'm so concerned about this motion that's been brought forward, because it undermines our ability to ensure that those kinds of insights, those kinds of points are incorporated. You know, we're here as MPs to make a difference for people. Like right now, on this issue, after the testimony we've heard, after you hear what I've shared with you today, the testimony I've read to you from Dr. Leah West, you know, how can we allow a report to go out from this committee that doesn't do everything possible to try to address the actual underlying problem of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the armed forces? I just don't understand how we could allow that to happen. And that's why I'm fighting so hard against this motion, because it wouldn't allow that to happen. 2 minutes per person, check the box, we did a report. That's basically what this would be. I don't know. If Dr. Leah West were here and in this committee room, like how would we look her in the eye and say, that was okay. Here's your report, Dr. West. Here's after months and months and months and months of talking, members of all sides of the aisle on this committee, talking about how much they care and how much they want to solve this problem, how awful it is, and how it needs to be stopped and how it needs to be dealt with. How could we then hand over a report that's based on 2 minutes of testimony from each MP on such a complex and substantive, important issue? Like, I just don't, that's impossible. And it's not based on consensus. It doesn't even take up all of the views of the members of the committee, which is always the case when reports are written in committee. How could we do that? I can't support a motion like that. I can't support a process like that and then look a survivor in the eye and say, hey, this is the best we could do. This is not the best we could do. And that's why this motion is so concerning. And that's why I'm speaking against it. And that's why I urge members I urge Mr. Bazan to withdraw the motion. I urge us to go forward and write the report like we always do as members of a committee. Committed, thoughtful, committed to the cause, to solving the problem, the cause of solving the problem, and thoughtful about how we go about doing it. Taking into account everything we've heard, everything we've learned, and our own experiences, and our own points of view, and our own understanding of the trade-offs of the various policy measures. But that's what has to be discussed and debated in the process of writing the report. Not 2 minutes of messaging that, frankly, the other members of the committee, it's not incumbent upon them to understand, because they know that once those 2 minutes are over, that member can no longer speak. And whatever happens to be on the page is going out. I mean, I personally can't allow us to do that when we know that this problem exists today. And we're just going to kind of walk away from it. And worse, pretend that we issued a report that matters. A report written the way would be dictated or be done in this motion would just undermine the effort of us actually tackling the problem. So I really urge Mr. Bazan to withdraw the motion. Let's move on to writing a report. Let's do it right away. Let's write it the way we always do. Let's sit down. Let's put our politics aside and let's write the report the way we always do, and just do something for the good of survivors. Do something that we can be proud of. I think we all ran for office to make a difference for folks. And I think there's an opportunity to do that by writing a strong report. And I just urge us to reflect on that. You know, Mr. Spengeman talked about the partisanship that happens in the House of Commons. I get it. It happens. I get it. We all get it. But like a year from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, when we're all no longer elected officials, we're going to look back on this study and we're going to hold it up. And I want to be able to hold it up and say, we made a difference. I don't want to hold it up and say, we ticked the box so we could write a report as a political game playing. And the problem of sexual assault and sexual harassment still exists in the armed forces. Because partisan games trumped getting something done for survivors. Come on. We're better than that. And this motion doesn't allow us to do that. So let's just do it. Let's do the right thing. Mr. Bagnall has proposed something. I think it's really constructive. He's basically saying, let's at least find the things that we agree on and move those things forward. There may be lots of it. There may be a little bit of it. I actually don't know. We won't know until we have the conversation. But what Mr. Bagnall's trying to do, I think, I don't want to speak for him, but Mr. Bagnall is talking about trying to move recommendations forward that help survivors, that help solve the problem. Let's at least do that. I'd love to hear the opposition's thoughts about Mr. Bagnall's proposal. Can we move forward that way? At the very least. I mean, that's still a departure from how we normally write reports, but it's a step in the right direction. He's trying. We're trying to get a constructive report out. But please, for 1 minute, think about how you're going to feel when you look in the eyes of survivors. Think about how you're going to feel when you're 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Maybe some of you will still be here at that time. I don't know. But 20 years from now, when you're no longer in office and you're talking to your kids, you're talking to your grandkids about what you did as an MP, what's the legacy we as members of this committee want on this issue? The legacy for me is, the legacy I want to have on this issue is that we worked incredibly hard, we got over our partisanship, and we just wrote a great report. We did everything we could. Alone, we can't solve this as members of a committee. I'm not naive, but we can make a big difference. Or we can not make a big difference. That's the fork in the road that we're at. And passing this motion is choosing not to make that difference. It's choosing to just tick the box and say we wrote a report. And then 10 and 20 years from now, when we're talking to our kids or grandkids or reflecting on it or whatever, we'll be saying, we won't want to talk about it because we'll have nothing to show for it. Let's write a great report. Let's help fix this problem of sexual assault, of sexual harassment in the Canadian Armed Forces. Let's do right by the survivors.
Thank you, Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. On to Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
J'avais compris que...
Did I understand correctly that Mr. Bazan wanted to speak?
Go ahead,
Madam
Mr.
Chair,
Bazan.
we're getting near the end of the time of our meeting, and that you have been suspending meetings rather than allowing debate to continue. And I just want to let you know that if you need to have a comfort break or anything like that, I'm more than happy to take the chair so that we can allow this filibuster to play itself out.
Thank you very much for your magnanimous offer, Mr. Bazan. Thank you. Back to Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
If you insist. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In order to clarify our decisions regarding the motion that we are currently considering, I would like to remind my colleagues of Report 5 regarding inappropriate sexual behavior in the Canadian Armed Forces. It is from the fall of 2018. That report wanted to indicate whether or not the Canadian Armed Forces had taken the adequate measures regarding inappropriate sexual conduct in order to support the victims and understand and prevent that kind of behavior. So I would like to remind our committee of certain recommendations. Researchers noted that the needs of victims were not always respected. depending on the policies of the military police, for all the files linked to inappropriate sexual behavior, the investigator needs to communicate with the victim the information on all local health services and support services available as soon as they meet for the first time. They also need to give them information on the Victims Assistance Program of the military police. A coordinator for victim services needs to notably examine the investigation and share any updates with the victim every 30 days until the file is closed. We've noted that for all of those, 31 of 46 of these files, at least one of those steps was not followed. In order to support victims and reduce the risk that they give up on their complaints, it is important to follow all of the steps necessary. For our sample, 33 out of 46 cases had been reported by a third party and not by the victim. In 4 cases, a commanding officer had put pressure on a victim for her to report the incident when she did not want to do so. In a quarter of those, 10 of 46, they led to accusations. However, in most of the files, 28 out of 46, there was not enough proof in order to lead to a charge. Of those 28 cases, the main reasons that evidence was lacking was the fact that the victim refused to report and there were no witnesses. That should make us think of the place of the victims and survivors in this process. Thank you.
All right. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur
Thank you, Monsieur Robillard.
No, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank some of the members that now these meetings have been extended for the tremendous amount of additional information they've provided. Mr. Svengeman, for instance, from other cases where these studies have been done, and in response to Mr. Baker's question as to what we will have achieved, we now have a tremendous record of data and information that those working on this, including Madame Abour, in the future can use to come up with actions and recommendations that still need to be done at that time. Certainly, if this committee can't come up with some recommendations, I certainly will be getting inputting my recommendations. And we've got a lot of certainly backup to make those from experts and survivors. I think before I get on to my my input on what I think the recommendations should be, if this is the only chance I get to do that, I did want to say that Mr. Garrison made a good point, that I think it would be fair for committee members to know how long the opposition is going to cause these inappropriate motions, our debate on this inappropriate motion, when they could adjourn the debate or the meeting so that we could either get on with the report or get on with other important business. And it'd be good for committee members to know when the opposition would stop bringing, when they plan to stop bringing back unreasonable motions related to, for instance, I mean, we had one email that was reported within 24 hours. No one knows what's in it because the member didn't want, and the report and the investigation was done and completed very quickly. So why would we have motions like bringing back witnesses that we'd already heard for up to 6 hours? etc. So it would be fair for the committee to know when the opposition members are going to stop bringing forward these things, causing these delays, stopping us getting to the report. And also, the committee members, before they move on, obviously they would have to know why the opposition members are suggesting no response from the government. I mean, my understanding is what committees do is they investigate with the expert witnesses. They study a topic. They make recommendations for the government to act on. So why do the three opposition parties don't want the government to act? Why do they not want a response to the report? It would be good to hear that before. Obviously, we have to hear that before we can go on with related to Mr. Garrison's request. And also the response, as Mr. Baker said, to my idea, if I didn't make it clear enough, it is a sort of a compromise from this apparent stalemate that's stopping us from getting to the report. And the compromise would be that we could start right away on the items we agree on, or go through every recommendation and see which ones we can agree to go through the Bazan procedure on, with a couple of minutes on each. We would have some things that we could tell the victims, as Yvonne said, we could be proud we had items to move forward on, and then we would go back, and the things that we couldn't agree on, we could have the normal debate on those that has the committee. And of course, we have, as Ms. Vandeveld mentioned, we also have this whole FISH report with a lot of valuable information that we can get into. If we can't get into it through a reasonable route through the committee, then we would have to bring that into here, into this debate. So just to give the time for the opposition parties to think about my compromise and have some comment on that, and comment on why there's no response from the government. I will, as I said earlier today, go on with some of the things that I think should be in the report, if this is the only time I get to say them. So first item is, and I would assume all the members would really want to have, from all parties would want to have their input into the recommendations. Not necessarily under the conditions of this motion. So one of the items would be, because there's suggestions that the effects, the results of investigations depend on, before I get into that, I just wanted to say, and also on related to Mr. Garrison's point, he, from some of the points he's made, he seems to have a slightly different tact or view from other committee on the emphasis on a particular part of our report, being on the political accountability. And if that's true, that's fine. That's his view. That's fine. But if that's true, then of course, as we all know, that since this we started our reports, there have been at least 3 detailed inputs and one was very recent, of evidence suggesting that political accountability is at the time of the appointment of General Vance. And there was a recent one, let's say June 1st. I'm not sure if Mr. Garrison has seen that, but I could read it into the record, but I won't right now because I want to stay on the important things of culture change and fear of reporting and chain of command. But really, if anyone that wants to deal with the political accountability, that's obviously from the facts that have come out, very recently, that's where it would be at. But I want to stay on the things that would help the survivors. And so, as I said, there has been input suggesting that the effects of investigations or reprisals or sexual misconduct is different between genders and ranks, junior, senior. So I think that data should be disaggregated and collected and analyzed as much as possible to help our decision making or our recommendations or Madam Arbour's recommendations. And I will certainly pass that on if I can't do it through the committee. Another item would be that we want to make sure that the recommendations we come up with or the procedures we come up with are really ensuring that the wants and needs of those impacted by sexual misconduct and other forms of non-inclusion, which the minister has been very strong on those other forms of non-inclusion, should be the guiding principle for research, for policy, program services, and benefits. And there's been some suggestions, I can't remember which report it was now, but that that I think administrative directives were suggested were not aimed at, were not centric around the survivors and around those victims. It was more centric around protecting the system. So that's why I think a recommendation along those lines would be valuable. I also think, of course, that to help Madame Arbour, that CAF needs to do a strategic review of the existing processes, including oversight from the beginning to the end, with the trauma-informed, survivor-centric, informed lens, which is similar to the first item I talked about. Also, I think there needs to be, in our recommendations or in our report, the trauma awareness. And some of that has come out through what Mr. Baker said today, but the many other victims that we've heard that have come to us either individually or through the committee, or you've heard even in the media. And from that, we have to respect that trauma effects and the dignity of the impacted individual, and that the trauma is not short term. It's not dealing with something, there's a penalty to the perpetrator and it's all over. This type of trauma will be in a person's mind quite often for the rest of their lives. And so somehow that needs to be reflected in the report, as the witnesses have said, and the seriousness of the recommendations that we make need to deal with that point. I also think we need to recognize that although it's a majority of times it affects women, as we heard from at least one witness, it's not just women that have been victims of this type of trauma. I also want to talk about the support systems. And as I've said before, I'm a little hesitant to talk at length about support because I think we should more concentrate on eliminating the problem so we don't have to have the support. But obviously, when you have, as myself and Mr. Garrison have outlined in detail, hundreds of cases, we'll still need support, and there's support from situations that have gone on long before we've studied this situation, because it can be long lasting. So part of that support that the victims have asked for is a peer support network that exists in other places, and it should be tailor-made for the military under the special circumstances, so that, and I know the military members of the committee would understand this, so that there can be a support network for a victim, and they can discuss with other victims of how they can move forward. Also, the seriousness, I think, of the of these types of these types of injuries should be really defined as a full operational stress injury and identified as such within the scope of the federal framework on PTSD. And I think that would give it more, it would put it in a more serious light, is where it should be. I think another area we need to do a recommendation on is on the attributes of a real ideal soldier should be modernized to reflect the realities of the 21st century military needs, including an examination of the CAF's present dominant heteronormative white European background assumed masculine culture, the values and attributes of the ideal soldier, and the impact this norm has on sexual misconduct reporting must be critically examined. And another area that we heard on numerous times was related to the requirements or the things that help lead to promotions. What's considered, what would be considered, how does that should be updated, the rewards of taking action, of taking the appropriate actions and not taking inappropriate actions, all need to be discussed. And I don't think any member of the committee doesn't think there should be a serious discussion on that type of issue. And I think I have a whole bunch more, but I think I will save them, except for one that I mentioned before, and I think it will take a more lengthy debate by committee members, because it hasn't been really talked about by members other than myself, and that's on how does it fit into the system, either the code of conduct or even offenses on reprisals. Obviously, reprisals, whether overt or not overt, have occurred in the past. But where is it listed that that's inappropriate, that that's an offense, that there's a result of having that offense on your record? I think if that was prohibited, it would certainly help many more victims come forward with the reports as the
Thank you, Mr. Bagnall. Suspended, dispendu.